Welcome to the Bean Pod, a podcast about decentralized finance and the Beanstalk protocol. I'm your host, Rex. Before we get started, we always want to remind everyone that on this podcast, we are very optimistic about decentralized finance in general and Beanstalk in particular. With that being said, 3 things. First, always do your own research before you invest in anything, especially what we talk about here on the show. Second, while you're doing that research, try to find as many well-developed, opposing viewpoints as possible to get the best overall picture. And third, never ever invest money that you can't afford to lose or at least be without for a while. And with that, on with the show. One of the most controversial terms in crypto right now is speculation. To some, speculation is the draw. It's the opportunity to be on the cutting edge of technology, the opportunity to develop new businesses and new ways of doing business, and certainly the opportunity to become wealthy. Now, all that being said, speculation isn't a foundation on which to build future economies. The risk and reward propositions that draw many of the bravest souls are not the same ones that will bring the average individual looking to grow their retirement fund. And similarly, speculative tokens, no matter how well advertised or influencer endorsed, aren't going to be what brings mainstream businesses into the crypto space. The name of the future game is, and indeed has to be, utility. Rather than asking, can this concept make people rich, founders instead need to be asking, can this concept compete with, and indeed outperform, current ways of doing business? Speculation is often hollow. Utility is what drives the future. For our project, Beanstalk's utility comes in the form of positive carry. The topic for this episode, Fluidity Money, is looking to improve transactional environments by giving random users rewards that can potentially far outweigh the costs of using their system. To tell us more, Maud and I are sitting down with Shahmeer Chaudhry, a member of the Fluidity core team, to tell us more about what they're working on. Shahmeer, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And Maud, welcome back.
Happy to be here.
All right, Shahmeer. So when I look through Fluidity's information, this project sounds to me like essentially like a blueprint for an entire economy that has the goal of getting people to actually use the tokens that they have as opposed to staking them or kind of sticking them away to earn yield. Is that an accurate understanding?
Yeah, that's quite the assessment of what we're building. And I'll further, go deeper into this, but one of the things that at Fluidity, we claim the problem that we're solving is what we've called or coined the term the utility problem. And the utility problem is, in a nutshell, the idea that incentive models in crypto are aligned towards speculation and holding on to crypto. Whereas if we want to make crypto an asset class where people use it, we actually have to come up with ideas of how to incentivize people to do so. And I think the idea is that people in crypto have just become accustomed to the fact that you need to have an incentive to do something. And so we're kind of creating that incentive layer, and that's what we call it, for people to actually go ahead and utilize cryptocurrencies.
Yeah, so tell me about that incentive. If I'm understanding your information right, there's some type of reward system where if I'm using Fluidity, there's a chance that I could I hate to say win some type of, I don't know, sweepstakes or something, but talk us through that reward system a little bit. It's very interesting.
Yeah, sure. Interesting you say sweepstakes because the original name of Fluidity was going to be that. Actually, I was going to call it sweet stakes just to make it even more
nice.
fun. But we realized that maybe it has a negative connotation, so we kind of went away from that.
That's actually why I hesitated to use the term because I felt like it had a negative connotation. Go on.
Yeah, so I guess I'll explain the way it works, and then it'll kind of start piecing the puzzle together. So what happens is that people come onto our platform and eventually it'll be any cryptocurrency, but we're starting off with stable coins. And essentially Fluidity is a wrapper. you give us one of, let's say, one USDC, and in return you get one fluid USDC. Now, what we do with that USDC is we lend it on a money market or some other yield strategy that it's extremely, extremely low risk. And that yield essentially goes into a prize pool. And that prize pool is where the yield or the prize money comes from. So when you've minted a fluid asset like Fluid USDC, you're free to spend it wherever you'd like with, one USDC worth of buying power. And let's say you buy $1 worth of ETH with it on chain, you every time you do a transaction, essentially you have a chance of winning money from this prize pool. Now, the idea is that once you aggregate, millions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of users, then you create a very interesting system where people that are transacting can be earning anywhere from a couple of cents to millions of dollars as part of the transaction. So we went with the more, I guess I wouldn't say lottery like, but more, I guess, dynamic price system because it actually came from some, interesting literature I read on slot machines and how they thought about prize making prizes and a little bit of literature we read on just designing this model. So yeah, it's actually so what we came up with was the idea of how do we distribute yield that we've earned from all these deposits to people that are using it. That I guess algorithm or formula is like the novel feature of Fluidity, really.
Yeah, so if Mod and I are using Fluidity to I don't know, let's say I'm mowing Mod's lawn every weekend, and Mod says, "Hey, I'll pay you in crypto," and I'm like, "All right, that sounds great," and we use Fluidity, and he is taking his USDC and he's wrapping it into Fluid USDC. He's paying me every time he's paying me, if I'm understanding what you're saying, it sounds like he has an opportunity to win something from the prize pool, and would I as the receiver as well?
Yeah, so when we were thinking about designing this, we were thinking, okay, when everybody builds a new payment solution, they're thinking, the sender incentives, right? Like why would the consumer use this? But they never think about counterparty incentives. So actually in Fluidity's case, you actually get 20% of the price that he won, right? So let's say he pays you $20 to mow
Nice.
his lawn and wins $1,000 as a prize, you actually get $200 just for accepting it,
That's a
right?
sweet
So
tip.
yeah. So the idea is that let's say you're a merchant and you're getting, hundreds or thousands of daily inbound transactions. Now, some of those guys will win money and you'll get 20% of that for just accepting fluid assets, right? So the idea there is we create those feedback loops where, both sides of the transaction are incentivized, but it doesn't end at like just people themselves. We're thinking protocols and entire networks would, be, I guess, incentivized from a system like this, right? So if you extrapolate this a little bit and think about at the protocol level, like a AMM or a DEX, right? If your counterparty is the protocol or the protocol smart contract, they actually earn money when you actually send them fluid assets and win, right? So this is an avenue for some protocols to actually start earning revenue without charging fees as well from those 20% counterparty incentives. We actually, I'll get into this a bit later as well, but we actually released an article where we guesstimated if Uniswap, didn't enable a fee switch, but only 5% of the volume of Uniswap was through fluid assets, they'd actually earn more money from fluid assets than they would from enabling a fee switch. So it has some interesting implications, at scale for a lot of protocols. They're looking to earn revenue.
Yeah, that is really, really interesting. And if I'm understanding what you're saying, I mean, really that also becomes essentially a zero fee scenario for your users, correct?
Well, that's where it gets a bit complex, right? The
Okay.
thing is that, if you think about a system like this, right, there's a lot of incentive for two bots to come in and send transactions back and forth, right? If that's how they make money. So we had to think about, okay, there needs to be like some sort of thing or a circuit breaker of sorts that, stops bots from attacking the system. And what we've come up with is essentially what we call the optimistic solution, and it's a bit, I guess, misleading in terms of what people normally mean by optimistic. But the idea is that we made an assumption that, okay, there are normally gas fees attached to any form of transaction on chain. And if the gas fees cumulatively, on average, were more than the yield you'd get from using a fluid asset, then essentially, if your only intention is to spam transactions, you lose money. So what I mean by this is that, if you do 1,000 transactions and pay $5,000 in gas fees, and you're guaranteed by some sort of, I guess, upper limit to win less than 5,000, statistically, you would, go bankrupt, right? So that's kind of what, like, the idea with how we protect against bots,
Gotcha.
and hence there is some upper limits that are part of the algorithm. Yeah.
Yeah, that's I mean that's a very interesting, and now that you mention it, I mean that is it's an issue that makes sense to address, because I mean it would make sense that someone could let loose a couple bots that just ring up transactions and just keep hitting that lottery over and over and over again with tiny amounts.
Yeah, so and now it starts to seem a little bit counterintuitive because a lot of people might be thinking, okay, wait, every time I use a fluid asset, I'm kind of losing money, which kind of makes sense from one, like, I guess, line of thinking. But the way we're thinking about it is, okay, if you do a swap on Uniswap and you pay $20 in gas fees, you wouldn't have done it if you didn't think you'd get at least $20 worth of value out of doing that transaction, right? So using a fluid asset, and let's say you get on average $2 back or something, it's still better than using whatever you were gonna use, right? Because you would have paid the same in gas fees. So I guess in terms of gas fees and any other fees, those don't exist by using fluid assets. So it's kind of like the same. And that's kind of the idea here is like, okay, you're technically expected value positive from using a fluid asset as long as your intention was to do a genuine transaction.
Gotcha. And so really the prize pool essentially offsets the cost that you are incurring by performing the transaction using a fluid asset, hence your ability to circuit break.
Yeah, so on average, that will be the case. You'll get some sort of like
Yeah.
kickback.
Yep.
Whereas, but there will be some people, right, that are, that are on the right side of the normal distribution curve that will win, a lot more money than they
Sure.
pay in gas fees. And that's the part of the system where it's gamified, where, hey, every time I do a transaction, I could potentially win $1 million under some circumstances,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's the fascinating idea here is that probability that, hey, you could win it. So it actually came from me reading this book about lotteries and casinos and designing them and all, like, I guess, the knowledge and literature behind it. And there's this, I guess, quote there, or this comment made by the author, and it said something like, people don't play the lottery for winning the prize. They actually play it for hope. It actually provides a service of hope. And I think it's such a fascinating idea where, you can, that's why most people play it, because they're stuck in, I guess, the endless rat race, and they're like, okay, this could be my ticket out. And just that, I guess, whatever it makes them feel is enough for them to keep continuing their purchases. And and so that's why we kind of went with the more, I guess, like exponential price system with a tier-based price system, because we can kind of replicate that in some manner without the parasitic part of like draining people's money.
Gotcha. So tell me about that tiered system.
Cool. So when we had to come up with how do we distribute this money, one way is that everybody gets an equal amount based on some sort of parameter. The other was, okay, we can make it gamified that we have a tier system. So we had our researcher, his name's Eric, really, really smart guy. And, he was reading through some papers of this very, I guess it was an old German paper, and it was about lottery design. And it was like, and we kind of read it and we extrapolated and repurposed it for our protocol. And so I mean, it's very simple in the idea that when you use a fluid asset, we have different tiers of prices, right? From like a couple cents to $1 million. And the idea is that these are six tiers. So we're going to start off with six tiers, but you can change that through governance. And essentially, every time a transaction happens, the user, in a sense, picks six balls from like this, I guess, metaphorical pool of balls, right? You pick six balls, right? And the number of matches, and we pick six balls, and the number of matches you get is the tier of prizes the tier you're in. So if you get one match between our balls, you get the first tier of prize, which is like 5 cents, and then if you get two matches, so on, right? So in our economics white paper on our website, we kind of explain what this looks like. So every time you do a transaction, what happens is that a table gets generated, and that table has a probability and an associated payout for each of the tiers. And you can then see, okay, this is the probability of you winning 5 cents, the probability of you winning 15 cents, and so on. So on average, 60 to 70% of the transactions will win something. So yeah, I mean, every other transaction, at least you will be getting some sort of prize, which is pretty cool in my opinion.
Yeah, that's very cool. So you're still in development, is that correct? Or did you say that you've launched on some test nets, or where are you at in terms of the project development?
So we've been on the Ropsten and the Solana DevNet for 6 7 months now, I think. And the plan is to launch on mainnet next month. Hoping the crypto market or Ethereum doesn't self implode. But yeah, I mean, we've been testing it for a while. We've had, multiple, thousands of people actually somehow test it. And yeah, millions of transactions going through the contract. So we have a lot of good data indicating that, hey, this thing actually seems to be working. And yeah, so the idea now is to actually, put it on mainnet and test it for what it is.
That's awesome. So the transactions that you've had thus far, I mean, primarily are they like user to user, or do you have any protocols or other, larger organizations involved in some of
So
those early
on
transactions?
on Ropsten, we created a Uniswap and SushiSwap pool for people to actually, use and swap fluid assets on. So that was pretty cool. And yeah, I mean, it was interesting to see the Uniswap pool winning prizes and stuff. So that's how it's on Ropsten. So right now what we're working on is getting more use cases and stuff happening. But I guess in the early days when we do launch, the first order use case would be like trading on dexes, and hopefully people realize, wait a second, if I trade using Fluid USDC to ETH instead of USDC to ETH and vice versa, I could actually earn yield, and that's enough of an incentive to people to start thinking about changing how they transact.
Shahmeer, if I'm understanding correctly, the prize money comes from staked assets, correct?
Yeah,
Is there an incentive to stake? Because the prizes go to who spends the fluid assets, but those who are like staking.
I guess the way we've thought about it is that liquidity comes naturally as a second order effect of the increased demand for utility. So, a lot of times, if let's say there's a lot of demand for spending these fluid assets, right? For them to exist, someone needs to mint them initially, right? And that's kind of what we're thinking about, is that we can bootstrap some of this liquidity ourselves and even reward people for it. But let's say there's a lot of demand for spending, Fluid USDC, and there's not enough in circulation. What's going to happen is that the price of Fluid USDC will go above $1, and then you'll have arbitrageurs that will, profit from that and hence mint a lot of Fluid USDC to sell above, the dollar parity. So we think that might be a way for us to kind of like just keep, get liquidity if there's a demand for that utility of that fluid asset, if that makes sense.
And Shahmeer, I'm looking at the white paper, and I see that you have, if I'm not mistaken, is this a governance token that has an emission schedule?
Yes.
So is this who is the governance token distributed to, and is it distributed to those who are providing liquidity?
No, so oh, that's a good question. Okay. So, as part of what we've built, right, we realized that wait a second, if we've created a system that allows for the fair distribution of yield, we can piggyback off of this, I guess, system or this foundation to distribute other things, right? And we realized that, hey, wait a second, we could distribute governance tokens to people for, using fluid assets, right? And that's how we are thinking about distributing most of our governance tokens. Is actually we've come up with a term called utility mining, and we see it as potentially an improvement on some parts of liquidity mining, where for the very first time, your users of a protocol can earn governance tokens, and for them to earn these tokens, they have to actually do something with your protocol or your token itself, right? So the idea is when people use Fluid USDC on different, decentralized exchanges, marketplaces, wherever on chain, they actually get a bonus, payout in native tokens, the very same way yield providers or liquidity providers would.
So just to confirm my understanding, the governance token is also distributed in a similar way to how the pool price is. The more you use the fluid assets, you might get a chance to get some of the governance token.
Yeah, so it's distributed in that fashion, yes. And the reason we rationalized that was that, what better way to distribute your own token than the thing that you've created? Because what we then realized is that we can go to protocols and help them distribute their tokens through the system that we've created. So an example I could give you is imagine you have an AMM, right? And this AMM wants to attract users, right? Normally what they would do is they would run some sort of liquidity mining program and get liquidity. Now, the issue is that doesn't necessarily mean an increased demand for their, trading volume, nor does it mean that your actual community and users will be getting these tokens. So you have two, I guess, areas of disalignment with your community and your objectives, right? So the idea with utility mining is that if they rewarded the users for using, their exchange, they'll naturally get liquidity because if there's higher trading volumes, because there's more demand for using it, then liquidity providers will naturally, come in to like earn that extra revenue. But secondly, your actual users for the very first time are getting tokens. So if I'm a user of this AMM, I'm now getting tokens, right? Unlike in the previous example with liquidity mining, where a lot of times it's mercenary capital or it's protocols that are plugging in that have nothing to do with the success of the AMM and so on. So the idea is that we can then go to protocols and say, hey, look, we've built an interesting token distribution model. Would you like to distribute your tokens to your actual users when they use, fluid assets through your protocol? And we're actually getting interest for this, right? So, there's protocols that are kind of stuck in the sense that, they can't compete with Uniswap as the leading AMM, and they have no way of like differentiating themselves in a saturated market. So if they're looking for more user order flow, they can now essentially incentivize that user order flow by, offering their rewards like this, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and you mentioned that the initial liquidity will be bootstrapped. Do you already have an idea what is the starting liquidity?
I'm not sure. We'll be using some of the funds that we've raised to bootstrap some of it, add some of it to the price pool to make things going. But yeah.
Clear, and thank you.
Yeah, no, of course. Yeah.
So Shahmeer, what is the primary function of the governance token? Is it to make decisions around the lottery pools themselves? Is it to change frequency of payout? Talk us through that a little bit, if you would.
Yeah, so there's two things happening here. One is obviously, changing and dictating the parameters of the protocol. But second thing we realized was very, very interesting. We were looking at curve wars and, the idea of curve wars and why protocols are paying so much in bribes to the, convex token holders essentially in effect the Curve token holders to vote for them in particular ways, right? Now, the Curve Wars is an interesting idea because, if we dictate Curve APYs or higher emissions for the Curve token, then, protocols can get liquidity and improve liquidity, and this is extremely valuable to them, right? So I went to thinking, well, okay, if you think about it, Curve Wars has a very limited, I guess, scope in comparison to the wider crypto space, even though it's such a big idea, right? The outcome of the Curve Wars doesn't affect Uniswap trading volumes. It necessarily doesn't even affect Uniswap liquidity. It doesn't affect OpenSea. It doesn't affect anything else other than just the liquidity of a few stable coins that participate. Yet it's such a valuable, idea or system. So imagine if you could, through our system, change the probability of payouts, right? Through governance. So imagine if we said this, right? You have two AMMs, Uniswap or SushiSwap, and if you chose to swap on your fluid asset on SushiSwap instead of Uniswap, you have a double chance of winning the $1 million, right? So if I'm a rational user and I'm thinking, or even if I'm an algorithm and I know this, I'm thinking, wait a second, why would I trade on Uniswap when I have a double chance of getting $1 million if I trade on SushiSwap instead, right? And given the fact that for most trades you're gonna get almost the same quote for most pairs, especially the larger the more popular ones, there's in effect no difference trading between the two. So in those scenarios, what we're thinking is that if user order flow, enough of it is incentivized to stop using Uniswap and then hop on to SushiSwap or whatever AMM that has better probability, this could actually open a very interesting dynamic of, what we call the fluidity wars that could potentially come. Because for the very first time, user or protocols have an existential crisis because their order flow or their customer flow is now being outbid by other protocols that are essentially, incentivizing this order flow, through either modifying our governance or playing a part in our governance or through their, participating in utility mining.
That is very interesting. So do you see a potential secondary market for your governance tokens, or is there anything on the horizon along those lines?
What do you mean by like a secondary market? Do you
So
mean like
when we talk about curve and convex, what goes through my mind are the potential of individuals either aggregating governance tokens or trading them potentially to leverage them to essentially run the bribe system. And the other thing that's spinning in my mind is if I want to be able to potentially influence how these pool decisions are made or frequencies, getting a hold of governance tokens is going to be in my best interest. So, do you see a future scenario where individuals may buy and sell the governance tokens on their own?
yeah, I do see that. And I also see a scenario where, like very similar to Curve, it's in the best interest for a lot of DAOs to actually, participate and have influence in governance. But it's not just, the stakes aren't just like the liquidity of a few select stable coins, but the stakes are the existentialness of the entire protocol. Because if, let's say, there's so much of an incentive to not use Uniswap any longer, the fact is that, the rationale for using Uniswap is no longer as much as, the incentive provided for not using it. Because if you think about it, liquidity mining is interesting because when 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 higher APYs have been offered from other protocols, people provide liquidity, but essentially it's just a reward for the risk that you're taking. But there's never been any sort of reward for risk of order flow or for using protocols. So by default, many people would just use the least risky protocol or the one with the highest reputation, i.e., Uniswap. So essentially, this kind of also acts as a way of subsidizing risk from the a bit higher riskier protocols that don't have that reputation that Uniswap may have, or some of the other like leading, protocols within their categories may have. So that's also something interesting, and yeah, I mean, what we think about is that, of course, probably there will be, markets of like things like convex or cartels being formed to basically, have influence. And we thought about this whole cartel narrative as well, like how cartels could come in the system like this. Potentially, it could be like, let's say, three dexes that, you know, accumulate so many tokens that they keep voting themselves in, uh, that they keep voting themselves in as the largest, or the winners all the time. That could happen. So we're thinking about ways to limit that as well. But the idea is that if this plays out in the way that we think it might, this could have a much bigger impact in the crypto ecosystem than any other sort of primitive or product that might have been created. Because if users don't use exchanges that don't win these votes, then those exchanges could lose out on user order flow and everything.
Shahmeer, I see on your website that you have two fluid assets, DAI and USDC.
Yeah, on the testnet, yeah.
On the testnet, yeah. Is this what you're planning to launch with, or are you considering other fluid assets?
Yeah, we definitely are considering other ones. We've integrated Frax, USDT, and obviously looking at others, even Beam as well.
And will all fluid assets share the pool price, or would each fluid asset have its own,
So each fluid asset has its own pool, because the thing is that when you deposit, let's say, USDC, you get paid in USDC on the money market itself. So, there's no, I guess, cross-contamination risk that, if you're using Fluid USDC, you don't want to get Tether, because if you don't like Tether, for example, and vice versa.
So if we were to talk about a fluid bean, then, and I'm not sure how familiar you are with Beanstalk. So Bean is the stable coin issued by Beanstalk, and then the silo is basically where bean holders can stake or deposit their beans and then earn bean seigniorage. So a fluid bean would be one that a user would deposit a bean to Fluidity, and then Fluidity would deposit it in the silo, and then it would issue a fluid bean, and then users who use that fluid bean might win whatever seigniorage or yield that is issued by the bean that's in the silo. Am I capturing all of this correctly?
And that's how it would work. And the idea is that those users are now incentivized to use Bean, essentially, because through Fluid Bean.
Got it.
So is there a scenario where, like, I could take Bean and I could put it through the Fluidity system, end up with Fluid Bean, and then it sounds like I could either obviously use that for transactions, or could I potentially put that back in the silo mod? Is that where you're getting at? Is
No, you won't be able to deposit the fluid bean because
Gotcha.
That's not whitelisted. So what you will do is you will use that fluid bean as a currency. And of course, correct me if I'm wrong, Shahmeer. And as you use it, someone from those who are using fluid beans will win the prize of the seigniorage that's by the silo. So you won't earn your normal seigniorage, but you might win a chance to win more than what you would usually otherwise have.
And the thing is, like, let's say you were using Bean to pay for something, right? Normally, let's say just the Bean itself, right? You wouldn't get anything extra per se, right? So the idea is that the people that use Fluid Bean, they're earning for using it, and if it's in their best interest to use it, then they're pushing to use it in all their day-to-day things, like even payments or just trading it, or even like buying NFTs, even like in those cases as well.
I think this brings us back to the comparison of pool together, which is like, many people can deposit in the silo and then one person will win that yield. But in the case with Fluidity, it's who uses it.
Exactly. And also, if you think about the pool together case, right, and this is very a significant difference. In pool together, the reason why we feel it may not have taken off is there's just too much opportunity cost. You could potentially put your money in and get nothing for a very, very long time. Or you could, farm like this week's Shiba Inu Ponzi coin for 3,000%, APYs, right? So that opportunity cost, I think, is one of the reasons why, that didn't work out too well. Whereas in Fluidity, if you really, really think about it, there's no opportunity cost, because as soon as you get Fluid, whatever, you can spend it, and your incentive is to spend it. So in a sense, it's a little bit like a hot potato, because as soon as someone gets it, their best interest is to spend it. Whereas in other cases, their best interest is to hold on to it, like any other staked form of asset. So
Yeah.
that's a differentiating factor of like how people are thinking about fluid assets in general.
And just to confirm, holding the fluid asset doesn't add to any of your chances of winning. It's purely about how often you spend it.
So in terms of holding, we're coming up with a part of the algorithm where DAOs, etc., could hold on to it and improve the payout of their protocol. So for example, let's say if Sushi DAO or Sushi's treasury or Uniswap's treasury is holding on to a bunch of fluid assets just for as a diversification and essentially providing liquidity in essence to Fluidity, their protocol users will actually get a higher probability of winning, just ever so slightly. So this might be an interesting initiative for protocols to take to like improve the chances for their users to win something, and by providing liquidity to Fluidity. So in those cases, yes, but for most cases where it's a small amount, your best interest is to actually go ahead and spend it. Whereas in other cases, your best interest is to hold on to it, like staked assets or any form of other yield bearing asset.
Yeah, it's interesting. So now I appreciate you guys walking me through this idea of this, beanstalk fluidity interaction. And what it says to me is that, if I've got beans, if I'm holding them, the best place for me to hold them is in the silo because they can achieve passive yield. If I'm spending them, sounds like the best option or a really good option would be to go through Fluidity and wrap them and then spend them, because then in the transaction itself, I've got the opportunity, to potentially receive a reward.
Yeah. And this reward could be a life-changing amount, I
Sure.
think. And that's why it's so fascinating, because if your intention is to spend Bean or any other currency and you get more of it, to the point where you might, improve your financial outcomes by doing nothing extra, I think that's such a fascinating idea that we've enabled. And in a very general purpose way, right? So eventually the idea is that you could use it on practically any protocol, because it's a regular token in standard ERC20 or whatever chain it's on. So there's no complex integrations required from counterparties either. So
Shahmeer, when can we expect you guys to go live?
well, hopefully starting next month, but towards the end of it, if all things go well.
Nice. Well, we'll definitely keep an eye on, and we'll look to that.
Awesome. Yeah. And we'd love to do things with Beanstalk as well. That could be another discussion as well we can have later.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's so, Mad, you just mentioned that idea of the whitelist, and Shahmeer, as you were talking about that idea of working with other DAOs or other groups, it's hard not to think, man, I feel like there might be an opportunity there somehow, for if their assets being held, that silo is a pretty enticing option for holding assets in the meantime, between transactions. It just seems like we're finally in a space where there are a lot of really good ideas that are starting to potentially mesh together. You're seeing those use cases intertwine a little bit more, and it's an exciting future.
So Shahmeer, take me through this here. For us to have a fluid bean and for there to be a chance for someone who uses a fluid bean for transaction to win something, there needs to be some beans that are already deposited in the silo, correct? Deposited with Fluidity, and Fluidity are then depositing in the silo. Is that correct? My question is, how will you attract the initial bean liquidity that you're going to get the pot price from?
So I guess to answer your question, I'd like to, propose the idea where people in the Beanstalk community or whatever community, they'd be in their best interest to actually earn Bean, for using their Bean. Now, the idea is for them is that the way they do it is that, they could help bootstrap these pools. And our goal is to be working with the communities and educating them about, okay, how they could benefit from this. Um, and yeah, and what Fluidity could be doing as well is, we can help, like we could put some of our funds towards, just starting a pool prize going as well, just so it promotes or nudges the initial community. But the idea here is that, once, like, hopefully the Beanstalk community or whatever community sees enough value there that, hey, wait a second, I could just mint Fluid Bean and use it because I was going to buy something else, and in exchange, I will potentially earn yield. And hopefully, this creates those feedback loops that grow it to a decent size enough that it's actually pretty interesting to use it. For some other protocols, we can be working with the utility mining side of it, where users might be thinking, I like this protocol, I want more exposure in their tokens. I'll be using it, so hence I'll mint more fluid or version of their token to get more tokens. So yeah, I mean it is the chicken or the egg sometimes, but I think like working closely with protocols in the communities and making them understand like potentially some ways they can accrue value from a system like this could be enough to get some people interested and like started into growing this. Yeah.
Got it.
So Shahmeer, we've just got a few minutes left. I want to kind of hand the mic over to you. I mean, you have any closing thoughts? Anything you'd like to share, with our listeners?
Well, I would like make people ponder the idea of what such a primitive existing could mean, and the implications of how they start thinking about spending cryptocurrencies or just utility in general. Because we talked a lot about DeFi use cases and like DEXs, AMMs, and stablecoins. But if you really think about it, if all your transactions or all forms of money transfer or value transfer was yield bearing, this also implies things like NFTs, right? So if I purchase an NFT with a fluid asset, me and the counterparty are exposed to yield opportunities for that action. If I obviously buy or sell something, but even if I play a game, right? So if in some games when you're buying and selling in-game items or whatever within the game, those all transactions could also be yield bearing through fluid assets. And eventually, what we want to do is start changing perceptions about what money could be in terms of when people think about spending it. Because right now, when you think about spending money, most people have kind of like a negative association with it, like, crap, I'm going to lose money. But who knows that maybe, if this idea really like grows, potentially, there will be a group of people for the very first time that are thinking, hey, wait a second, spending money rewards me, and it's just the behavior of money that money itself rewards you for using it. And and yeah, I mean, it seems like a very broad idea or thought, but I think it's so interesting because once you start thinking of such implications of a primitive, it can go endless. So a lot of times, what we think will happen is people won't even know it, but they'll be interacting with the fluid asset, some part of middleware. So I'll give you the example of an aggregator, right? And the aggregators, the way they work is that they find the best route possible with the highest expected outcome for whatever trade route you want to do. But as part of their route construction, they could also integrate a fluid asset. Let's say you want USDC and you want ETH in the end. You could go from USDC to ETH, but imagine if aggregators realize that wait, USDC to fluid USDC to ETH could potentially provide you a better route because that interaction with that fluid asset could mean a price amount, and on average the payout is higher than not doing it. and people won't even know it, but they're earning yield for those type of interactions, right? And it's middleware. One thing that we were discussing with, like early conversations with even like options protocols is that when people deposit into their vaults, they could also be using fluid assets, and the option protocol would be getting the stable coin of choice. But just because they deposited a fluid asset in that options protocol, they actually now have a chance of winning. Things like gambling as well, like you can double dip on making every time you make a bet. If you make a bet using a fluid asset, you could potentially win a prize just for making that bet. So things like that could be very, very interesting, and like implications of it could be endless. So if anybody listening to this, or even you guys, have any idea of or any interesting thing that you want us to explore, we're all ears. And yeah, and I think it's an interesting or very exciting frontier that we're, digging at.
Shahmeer, it sounds like they should be talking to the Root crew, Mr. Manifold and company, because that is that idea of, nested opportunity, let's say, that's really fascinating.
We'll definitely pass the message, and they'll also listen to the podcast.
That's perfect. Well, Shahmeer, thank you so much for joining us this morning where you are, this evening where we are. We appreciate your time.
No, of course, guys. I appreciate you hearing us out.
Thank you, Shahmeer, and wish you all the best with the launch next month, hopefully.
Awesome. Yeah, fingers crossed.
And Mod, thank you as always for joining.
Pleasure is mine.
You can find Shahmeer on Twitter at ShahmeerX, that's ShahmeerX, and Fluidity on Twitter at Fluidity Money. And you can also find Fluidity on the web at fluidity.money. The Bean Pod is a production of Beanstalk Farms, a decentralized autonomous organization. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, Medium, Discord, and our home on the web at bean.money. You can also find me on Twitter at RexTheBean. And as a final reminder, this podcast is not financial advice. Thanks again for listening.